So first of all, this afternoon now, we're going to hear from Rachel Stone and Lee Johnson. Rachel is the team leader for the HR and Safeguarding Specialist team at the Baptist Union of Great Britain. And Lee Johnson is co-leader of the Ministries team at the Baptist Union of Great Britain. They're going to present to us now, telling us some of their experiences and some of the things that they see at the grittier end of church disciplinary processes, I think. So I'm going to hand straight over to Rachel.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you this afternoon. Yes, my name's Lee Johnson. I am the co-team leader with my colleague Tim Ferguson from the Baptist Union, and here with Rachel today. Rachel and I work very closely together on ministerial discipline issues and cases. Rachel's been working for the union for about 10 years. Do you want to say any more? Or yeah.
I'm going to own up right at the beginning. I've not been working in safeguarding for my whole career. I'm an HR specialist. So before I came to the Baptist Union, I was a partner in one of the big professional services firms running the HR consulting service, and then an HR director in a number of public and private sector organisations. Before then, just to say, be careful what you wish for. I came to the union, and in my first week in, my boss said to me, Rachel, we really need to do a big review of our safeguarding approach. And I said to him, that's great. Who are you going to get to do that? And he said, well, you do loads of management review, so we thought that you might do it. Now, I was a youth leader. I helped out in my church, but I'm certainly not a safeguarding expert. But I was by the end of that one-year strategic review. And it's my honour and pleasure to lead the Baptist Union safeguarding team. Two of my team, Nikki and Anna, are here today and are far more skilled and knowledgeable than me, but they are patient with me.
Thank you, Rachel. And I've been working with the Baptist Union now for 2.5 years. As I say, I'm co-team leader. I kind of take responsibility for much of the processes that we have, which also includes the ministerial discipline process. Before that, I was a regional minister in London for 5 years. And before that, I actually led a church and told people about Jesus, which is also great and was really, really good. I guess as a regional minister, I perhaps worked more closely with churches and ministers as they went through issues and problems than perhaps I do now. It feels like I'm a step away now, and often I'm supporting associations in our context and regional ministers who themselves are more on the ground. So I kind of can see it from this position and also from that position, and I also do remember actually being a minister of a church and dealing with safeguarding issues in that context as well. So in a sense, I've had the opportunity to see the full range from a Baptist perspective. In this session, we are going to offer some practical insights, I guess, some practical perspectives from two people who have been charged by the Baptist Union to investigate complaints that relate to Baptist ministers. And Rachel and I, when we talked about this, have agreed that we're going to be fairly direct. We're going to give you some appropriate examples, some of which we are still engaged with at the moment. Clearly, we'll be mindful of that. But to actually say this is actually what it looks like from day to day for those of us that are actually dealing with this on the ground on a more regular basis than perhaps we would choose to do so. I'm going to start by telling you a little story, if that's okay. I had a video to go with the story. Actually, we're on slide 2 now, if that's all good with the slides. Sorry, Rachel did say to me, say next slide, and I forgot. This slide should have been a video, but for various reasons it's not. So I was on holiday the week after Easter, and with some friends, we were celebrating big birthdays. We've done that for a few years, and we were walking in the botanical gardens of the particular city that we were in. We decided to do that over breakfast, and unbeknown to me, my friend who we were with had put some bread in his pocket, and I'm not quite sure why, but he had. I think it was to feed the birds, which is an interesting picture in itself, isn't it? Because clearly you're not supposed to give birds bread, so feeding birds bread is actually not a good thing. Anyway, we were walking around the botanical gardens, and we happened upon this really huge pond. It was a significant pond, and my friend took his bit of bread and he threw it in. And what I was going to say now is this is what happened, which was the video of the ripples on the water. I think we might have some picture there of the water. But basically what happened was the very, very flat, still water, there was this ripple effect that took place. This wasn't a big rock. It wasn't even a small stone. It was just a little piece of bread that had a significant impact. And in the video, you can kind of see all the trees rippling. Lisa did say she was going to do it for me, but we thought we wouldn't do that. In fact, Justin said he'd give me 50 quid if I got her up here doing it. But our actions have consequences. In this bread situation, the large pond was disturbed. That was the consequence of throwing the bread in. If you are a minister of a church, if you are a leader of people, it's important to recognize, it's important to remember that the effects of the things that you do and say reverberate both for good and also for ill. We've already looked at some case studies, haven't we, of people and situations where those things have been very clearly presented to us. If you hold a position of authority, the effects, the reverberations, the ripples, if you will, of what you say and do will have an impact on those people around you. They will, for both good and for bad. In the context that we are thinking at the moment with regard to ministerial discipline and the difficult situations that we have to deal with, they will have an effect upon the church that you are perhaps the minister of, or the ministry that you're involved in. In the Baptist Union, we have ministers that are chaplains and church ministers and pioneers and all sorts of things. There will be an impact in those circumstances and situations. There will be an impact in the community that you are engaged with, whether that's the geographic community of the church that you're a minister of, or the communities that perhaps you are part of for all sorts of reasons. My wife and I have taken up dancing recently, and we've got this new little dance community that we're now a part of. So we have all sorts of different communities that we relate to, and there will be an impact there. And of course, there is also an impact on friends, family, yours, perhaps the people that you are engaged with. As Rachel and I planned today, we felt this ripple picture was really helpful for us as it reminds each one of us that what we do doesn't just stay with us. In fact, what we do has the potential to impact more people than perhaps we might even begin to first recognize. So as we consider this picture of ripples, of ministers acting inappropriately and perhaps the ripples that might cause, let's be clear, this is a wide thing, not a narrow thing. Rachel.
Next slide, please. Well, we wanted to talk today about the reality of what we see when ministers choose to abuse people that they should be serving. We want to talk a bit about the wider impact when that happens, and we just wanted to reflect with you about what in day-to-day reality we see happening, we see as contributing factors to the damage that ministers and church leaders can cause when, for whatever reason, they choose to do harm to others. So we're going to look at 6 questions in our session. What happens when ministers step over healthy boundaries? I'm going to talk briefly about oversight and accountability and the risks when there isn't oversight and effective accountability. We want to share with you some examples of what happens when ministers respond to allegations, concerns raised, which might surprise some of you. We want to go on and talk about how churches react and respond when their minister or church leader has allegations of abuse made against them, maybe particularly when those allegations are found to be true. how churches respond to those who've brought those allegations, those who have been victims of tremendous harm and are often harmed again by the church response. And we'd like to touch briefly on the impact of ministerial abuse on church and community life, recognizing that there is often an incident and an event which might be a matter of months, but following on for that are years of the ripples of that incident and the work that needs to be done to try and heal and mend. So if we could go on a slide, please. I'm constantly amazed when people come to interview and I ask them how they got into the situation that they were in. And their response is normally a series of steps. Not many people just decided one day to dive in and do something awful. That does happen, but that isn't normally what we hear. We hear about people who've made series of choices that were ill-considered, thoughtless, foolish, and sometimes deliberate. Now, I need to say this because I'm not a Baptist minister, but I work with lots of Baptist ministers, including Lee, and I want to be clear that the vast majority of Baptist ministers that I meet outside of my role are people I have huge time and respect for. They are morally and ethically sound. They love the Lord, and they have come and answered a calling to serve his people and to bring people to a place where they can meet Jesus. It's an admirable calling. But those aren't the people that I get to deal with most of the time. The people that I and my team get to deal with are a very small percentage of our ministers, but enough to keep our whole team busy all the time. We see, and Tim is going to be speaking on ministerial formation tomorrow. I'm looking forward to that. We see that there are things that are really important messages at the early stage of ministerial formation, things that someone training for ministry needs to understand, needs to internalize if they are going to be a safe person to be around and they're going to be able to work safely. But I would say that many of the ministers that I meet with are not students. I do meet some students, but most of them are 10, 20, 30 years into their ministry. So if I look back on our cases for the last 5 years involving accredited Baptist ministers, earlier on, Helen put up a list. I'm going to put up a more individualized list, if I may, to complement what you said. So some of the factors that make ministers more likely to step over the lines. So first of all, isolation. I keep meeting ministers who don't appear to have any real backup or anybody that they are earnest and honest with. I see a lot of ministers who are quite disappointed with how their ministry turned out. As of yet, they've not been a main stage speaker at Spring Harvest, and they can't quite understand why. Maybe they don't feel they get the recognition from their church or their community for their deep spiritual wisdom. Some of them fail to build any sorts of balance into their life so that they have something that enables them to stay on the right track. And that could be anything from basic personal spiritual disciplines to those who are just workaholics and never stop and reflect. For some, it's family pressure or marriage pressure that takes them to places they weren't expecting to be. And I want to be really clear, none of those things are excuses. There isn't an excuse to do the sort of harm that we see. But I do see they are contributory factors to people being in the wrong place and continuing to move in a wrong direction. I'm also really sorry to say that often talking to ministers in investigations about the impact of what they've done on others, most of them have never thought that through. You'd think, wouldn't you, before you went and stood on the edge of a cliff, that you'd at least have a look to see how far you might fall. Well, we don't see that happening. We see people who have never even dawned on them, for example, that when they started sexual encounters, let me call them that, a phrase someone used with me recently, with young people in their church, that perhaps their wife wouldn't stick by them in that situation since they had teenage children themselves, that perhaps their wife might be more concerned about the safety of their own children and their children's friends than propping up a marriage to someone who has chosen to have sex with children. We see that ministers sometimes don't seem to understand that it's not just the victims, it's their families, it's their friends, it's church congregations who are utterly bewildered by what has happened, who are affected by their actions. I want to give you two examples. These are both real cases. Clearly, I'm not going to use any distinguishing information. Anna and I interviewed a young minister a few years ago. A 15-year-old girl had come forward and told us that she was in a sexual relationship with this minister, who she believed that she loved. He came to interview denying it completely, but we just sat and we were careful and we went slowly. And over a period of 4 hours, he admitted to that sexual relationship and 4 others with teenage girls. He then also admitted that he often sent sexualized messages to the girls he met in his school's work. And at the end of that 4 hours, and it was pretty harrowing to be in, he had brought a friend with him who was a minister whose face was growing paler and paler as the hours went by. He was in tears at the end, and he said, "I just need to say something." I said, "Over to you." And he said, "I know this sounds bad, but I just wanted to tell them about Jesus." That was the moment I found most difficult in the whole of that interview, because I felt so very angry and sad that this man who'd done so much harm was still so blind to the impact of what he'd done. And as you might imagine, they had young girls who were their daughters. Their wife left him. Took the girls away quite sensibly. His ministry is done. And his church were just left completely in ruins by this. And then I want to tell you about one of the very first cases I ever dealt with when I was very new into being part of the safeguarding team. When the letter came in about this case, I couldn't believe it. I had to go and sit in a corner for a while. The letter said that a minister who had been in Baptist ministry for almost 40 years had been grooming some of the vulnerable women in his church. 3 women of various ages, all really, really fragile and vulnerable, all needing all the help and support that they could get. So he had set out to have a special ministry to these 3 vulnerable women. There was a flat attached to the church, and he would take them to the flat on a regular basis. He would talk to them about how much God loved them. He would talk to them about how precious they were. And then over a series of months, he would start getting them to undress. At a certain point, these women would be naked, he wouldn't be. And then he would start to touch them. And this just went further until these 3 women, not all at the same time, but separately, were being sexually assaulted and raped on a regular basis by this man. And the thing that got me, that means that 10 years later I still remember this case, was what they said he said to them as he raped them. He said to them, "Let me be like Jesus to you." I cannot tell you how angry that makes me a decade on. I can feel it, even just saying it now. So we realize that people do this harm, maybe thinking they're unseen, they won't be found out, no one will be believed, and that their ministerial status will cover them. And sometimes it does, and that's the thing that frightens me, is that out there in our church communities are people who've been harming others for decades, and still no one has found out and no one has tackled it. In the Baptist Union, we've been working quite hard to think about what oversight and accountability looks like. Brandon, if you could move us on one, please. Thank you. When you were 6, did you have a best friend? Yeah? I had a best friend, his name was Simon. He was great. He had ginger hair. That's all I remember about Simon, apart from the fact that when I told him to do things, he came along, which is a good quality from my 6-year-old perspective. I told Simon everything. He lived just down the road from me, and we'd head off and have adventures and just be generally naughty and not come home when we were told. And Simon was the person I trusted. If I had taken some biscuits from the kitchen, I'd go and eat them with Simon in the garage round the back. If I had accidentally dropped things off the washing line and now they were all dirty and my mum was going to have to wash them again, it was Simon I told. I utterly trusted him, and he trusted me. I remember that fondly, that friendship. But as adults, it's a little bit different, isn't it? Sometimes we just don't have someone other than our spouses who we utterly trust. Society has changed. Lee's going to speak about that in a minute. Society has changed. And so many people don't have somebody they believe they could tell something to, a bit like me and my taking the biscuits from the kitchen, but on a far, far more serious scale. They don't have someone they could go to. I realise in my life it's really important to have somebody, I'm going to pick on Nikki who's sitting there, that I could go to Nikki and say, Nikki, I'm really ashamed to say this, but I'm really struggling with something. And I know I shouldn't be going there. And I know I need to step back. And I know this isn't right, but I feel compelled. Because Nikki would say to me, Rachel, it's a brave thing to do to tell me about that. Let's step you back from that as fast as we possibly can. And if I'm not yet at the cliff edge, maybe we can do that and get me out of danger and other people out of danger. In other cases, Nikki might be the person then whose advice I have to take and say, you need to own up to this. You need to confess and you need to deal with the consequences. We see examples from ministers. We see pornography addiction, which is not confined to ministers, but to large proportions of our society. We see ministers who, at some early point, were attracted to a teenager in the church and didn't go to say to someone they trusted, I'm ashamed to tell you this, but this is what I'm feeling. Help me move away from this. Maybe the opportunity with some of the elderly folk in the church who offer really significant financial gifts that perhaps they can't really afford, but they want to defer to you because you're the minister. Far fewer people have got the kind of accountability relationships that would get them out of trouble at an early point. Of course, some people we speak to aren't looking for help to stay out of trouble. They're looking for trouble because they believe they have the power and the influence and the authority and the sheer gall to be able to do the things they want to do and get away with it. They believe that power, status, influence will allow them to get the things that they want or that they believe they deserve. We see an increasing number of people who come into interview trying to defend the completely indefensible actions that they've taken. So we've been doing some work to try and encourage our ministers in accountability as one of our core parts of their ministerial development programme. And Lee's offered to share with us how he does that.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Before I do that, I just want to pick up on this idea that Rachel just hinted at, I guess the societal change that we, I think, are seeing. If I talk to many ministers about the impact that society has on the church, often they talk in very negative terms about that it's much more difficult to do this because of health and safety, or it's much more difficult to do this because of whatever it might be. I'd like to argue, though, that some of the societal change that we are seeing actually brings a positive change to our church and our church culture. And I think this is really important. Helen, you started a few minutes ago talking about the Lord's anointed. I was brought up in a church home. My parents actually are ministers. When I was 17, I finally made a commitment to Jesus. And I was baptized on my 18th birthday, which was Easter Sunday, into a Pentecostal tradition. I could well hear my grandma saying, don't touch the Lord's anointed. He is the man of God. Of course, then it always was a man, particularly in a Pentecostal setting. If I heard a minister say, don't touch the Lord's anointed today, I would want to have a conversation with them pretty sharpish to try and unpack that with them and say, what do you mean by that? What's behind that? What are you saying? Another story, everything that Rachel was talking about earlier, these are issues that we are dealing with. Another story. Recently, I had to read the account of a 14-year-old girl who was expressing the unwelcome touch of a minister. Wasn't a sexual thing. The minister thought he was helping her in the context of worship. He went behind her and suggested that she raised her hands by helping her to do that from behind. Now, this person's 14. At 14, I wouldn't have been able to write in the way that she did. But it's clear to me that society has changed to the point where she feels able, comfortable, has the language, the appropriate language to express why that was inappropriate. I think that's a good thing. I think that's helpful for us. I think that brings us to a better place and makes us a more safe place. Talking to fellow ministers recently, it seems to me that since lockdown, our approach to touch needs to be rethought. We need to rechange the way perhaps we think about touch. I was talking to a friend of mine just a few days ago who was suggesting that perhaps we need a theology of pastoral touch for today. I'm 57, which gives you an idea as to the holiday we do big holidays with our friends, big numbers. So it was a 60th birthday. I'm still getting my head around one of my closest friends is 60 because I don't think I'm old enough, but hey. And I went to Bible college over 30 years ago, which is also just a bit of a shock, to be honest. My practice, my formation needs to grow and develop and not stay where it was 30 years ago. Because some of the things that we did 30 years ago, quite frankly, I look at them now and think, oh my goodness, did we really? You know, I would go after the youth group, I'd just stick all the kids in the car and take them home and not think twice about it. I mean, that was just what we did in the eons of time back in the 80s, whenever it was. My practice needs to change. My practice needs to grow. It needs to develop. As ministers and leaders, our practice needs to be appropriate for today, not for then or then. And so I think it's helpful for us to recognize that culture is changing and that is having an impact on the church. And I think that that's a positive thing, that we should embrace the good in that. So what about me? What do I do? If you're a Baptist minister, you're invited to practice the 5 habits of continued ministerial development. And those habits are learning, attentiveness, accountability, connection, and review. Now, what I'm going to say to you next isn't rocket science. This is just basic stuff. It's just simple stuff. The main ways that I find support is actually through relational accountability, so through connected accountability. I have 2 friends who are also Baptist ministers. I've told them that I'm going to out them today. They're okay with that, so we're all safe, we're all good. One of them's called Rob May, and he's now a regional minister in South Wales. One of them's called Johnny Pozzo, and he's a Baptist minister, a regional minister in the north east of England. We have been in that same ministry triplet for 20 so plus years now. We've been intentional about meeting. We were in London together for years, so it was easy. We used to meet on the South Bank and go and have a beer and have a chat and kind of chew the stuff together. Bit more tricky now. They were all at our house 2 weeks ago. We had a whole weekend together with our wives, which was great fun. But we have to be much more intentional. So Teams is our friend. We meet on a regular basis on Teams. I know that both of those 2 people would say to me, Lee, are you okay? Lee, are you behaving yourself in an appropriate way? They would ask me that. We've given one another permission to do that. Now, that's taken time. It doesn't happen in 2 minutes. And if you're a minister here and you've not got that, then I would encourage you to start to work out how you might begin to develop those sorts of accountable relationships with appropriate people. I also pay for pastoral supervision, which for me is really key and critical. I have somebody that's a highly skilled supervisor. She is actually a clinical supervisor. She's a counsellor, a clinical supervisor, well known within the counselling world, particularly the Christian counselling world. The Association of Christian Counsellors in this country deliberately picked somebody that had got a high level of experience, because I felt I needed that. What's been really interesting as I reflect on my own support network is that in my new role, I see her more regularly than I did when I was a regional minister. That kind of makes sense, I guess. But there are things that I need to talk to her, that I need to process with her in a professional environment. And so that's really important. And then having good co-workers, and I guess I'm turning around and looking at Rachel and other people in the team at Baptist House as well, is also really, really important for me. Learning, of course, that's important, and it's important for us to continue to learn and to grow and develop, and that can look like all sorts of things, like being here for these 3 days and thinking about this subject. Attentiveness to ourselves is also important. Review, thinking about where we are, is important. But for me, that accountable connectedness is the thing that really keeps me healthy and sane. And whilst it's not always easy to see patterns in our investigation work, and people will often say to me, what's the picture? What's the pattern? Why? It's not always easy to see. Rachel's already touched on this, but for me, one thing is clear. Most of the ministers that we deal with who act in inappropriate ways don't have good scaffolding. They don't have good accountability structures in place. And if you're a minister sat here today, the Bible does say, if you think you're standing firm, be careful you don't fall. That could be you if you don't put that structure in place. You need to sort this out. And for me, I guess if I only landed one message in this 50 minutes that Rachel and I have got, it would be that. If you're a minister, make sure you've got this sorted, because it will help you in so many ways. And if you know ministers, if you're related to a minister, if you know leaders, how might you help them to think this through for themselves? Is it me or you? I'm not sure now. Sorry.
It's me.
It's you. Well, that's good.
Okay.
Then, isn't it?
Thank you, Lee. And for all of us, whether or not we're ministers, I think this question of who do I make myself accountable to in my life is a vital one. Well, look, I'm going to talk for a little bit about our investigation process. I'm going to do that quite practically. If you're very, very academic, please bear with me. I just want to talk to you about what we actually do with the allegations that come in to us. So they often come in 2 ways. One will be a phone call. And I have to say, for all of us on the team, when we get those calls and we sit on the phone for maybe 2 or 3 hours as someone who's psyched themselves up to tell us their story does so, we all feel really honoured that someone chooses to tell us their story. Sometimes people write to us and write very clearly, very cogently about what has happened to them, the people who've witnessed it and the evidence that they have. That's also helpful. When we get an allegation in, we do 3 things first of all. So our first thought is, do we need to report this to the police or to social services? And if so, how do we help the person who's brought the issue to be comfortable with either doing that themselves or for us to help them with that? Secondly, we want to make sure that the complainant, particularly if they are an alleged victim of abuse, has got enough good support around them. Who's walking with them? Who's looking after them? What do they need right now? And then thirdly, we think about what action we need to take straight away to reduce the risk. So in some cases, that means we need to suspend ministers straight away. We don't want them anywhere near the rest of their church congregation. In other cases, it might be that the risk is far less and we're able just to instruct ministers about staying away from those who've raised issues. If the police aren't taking up the case, we move to our own formal investigation process. So we start with information from victims, from complainants, and from those people they would say would be able to back up what they've told us. People who might have witnessed behaviour, not people who've heard it third or fourth hand, but people who were maybe close by when something happened. That's very difficult when it comes to sexual abuse cases. But we say to people, who would have known that you were there? Who might have seen you coming out of that house, etc. We start with them first because sadly it's our experience that if we go to the minister first, which we haven't done for years, and sometimes the minister will act to attempt to control the situation. I remember a minister a few years after I started whose response to discovering that he was going to be investigated was to write to each person who was a potential witness and threaten to sue them. Not a desperately godly response, I must say, but that was his response. So we gather as much information as we can, first of all, and then we invite the minister to come and meet with us. I think when I first started, ministers thought they would come to Baptist House and we would give them a cup of tea and some nice biscuits, and we would say to them, now look, somebody's written to us, they seem quite disturbed. Can you tell us your version? And the minister would say, well, of course, that's rubbish, I didn't do any of that. And we would say, oh, of course, thank you so much for coming down to see us. It doesn't work that way anymore. We often have ministers who are very bothered by the way we run our investigation meetings because we are polite and respectful, but we are clear and direct and challenging. We are organised. We have pages and pages of questions ready to go before we step into the room. And we do expect ministers to answer our questions. Some ministers engage really quickly and earnestly with that process. That's good when that happens, but sadly, many others don't. It's very common for us to deal with ministers who will come and sit in a room 4 feet away from us and lie to our faces. We know they're lying because we already have enough evidence to show what they have or have not done. It's also very common for ministers to attempt very early on to discredit the people who've brought the allegations. And I see a 3-step pattern that I see again and again. And whenever I hear it, alarm bells go in my head. And it goes like this. Gosh, well, I'm so saddened to hear about those allegations. You know, this is a person in my church and I love them. And I can't imagine what might make them think to bring those allegations, but no, could it have happened? I don't think so, not like that. I don't really recall. And then they go home from the interview and they write to us the next day, and that second note says, I did none of this. I now do recall, this is nonsense, I did none of this. And then normally a couple of days after that, we get the next note, and the next note says, you do realise that this woman is hysterical, mentally ill, obsessed with me, etc. The desire to discredit victims is so strong in people who are used to being in control. We also see that at this stage, some ministers are trying to control the narrative inside the church as well. They could have started to present themselves as a victim. We have a case at the moment where someone decided to tell the whole church a little bit about their scenario, forgetting to mention that they were accused of abuse. They could be saying, the leadership team are out to get me. It's so stressful to be the minister here. Sometimes they'll say, the union are out to get me. In fact, Nikki and Anna and I quite regularly get told that we are launching personal vendettas against ministers who we have never met or heard of before the allegations arrive with us. And we have a rule that if you know the minister in any way whatsoever, you can't deal with that case. We also see that ministers try to rewrite the story of events. This happens quite early on. They do this to present themselves in a positive light, or to present the complainants as people who are out to damage their ministry or to harm the church. These people are spreading lies and division, and you need to be very wary, members of the congregation, that you're not impacted by this. Others will attempt to dominate in the interview situation. I normally find that quite amusing, but not always. I was saying to Lisa and Justin earlier, we were interviewing a very, very confident minister. One might even say manipulative. He came into the interview with us, and just after we'd introduced ourselves, he reached into his backpack and he pulled out a copy of Lisa and Justin's book, Navigating the Maze of Spiritual Abuse. And he waved it like this. And he said, I guess you've read this book, which was a pretty good guess. And then he said, I have read this from cover to cover, and I want to be clear with you that I have not done anything that's covered in this book. So you don't need to take that any further with me. What do you think he was hoping from that? I think he's hoping I would say, oh, thank you so much. That's great. That's 3 pages of questions we don't need to worry about. As you might imagine, we thanked him for his comment and continued, and that man was removed from ministry on several safeguarding grounds, including spiritual abuse. What is interesting is that now, and I say this as someone who grew up in Baptist churches, who grew up with great respect and reverence for the people who were my ministers growing up. I think now we got to a point where we make an assumption that somebody is going to likely to try and cover their tracks when they come and meet with us. It's not always the case. So some people, as I say, are earnest and upfront and ashamed. We've also now reached a point where we believe that most investigation process will not only be the investigation and the outcome, there'll also be an appeal and a complaint that follows, in which every part of our process will be picked apart. And the only thing that person won't mention is the abuse that they perpetrated on someone else. It'll all be about what's wrong with the rest of the world and not about us. So I would say in the 10 years that I've been involved with safeguarding investigations, and I have a history before that of sadly having to sack chief executives, finance directors, managing directors, etc., who can be equally compelling and charming and lovely until you catch them. I would say that I've seen an increase in ministers holding the belief that if they come and they demonstrate their power, their status, their charm, their ability to be articulate, their ability to pour oil on the waters, that they will be believed over those people from their congregations, the very people they are there to serve and protect, as we would say, that they can talk their way out of situations. So Lee's going to talk for a little bit about how churches respond when these things happen.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to do that from 2 perspectives, if I may. First of all, from our perspective, and then also from the perspective as a regional minister who actually walked with churches as they the other side of issues with regard to ministers. Often when we step into church situations as part of our process, we aren't always welcomed. Sometimes by all, sometimes by some. It varies, obviously, but we often expect ourselves to not necessarily be welcomed by all those, or even any of those people that we are dealing with. Our process is such that we are slightly hands-off. We use our regional teams to help us, but still, it's very clear from the regional team that they are working on our behalf and in partnership with us, and so that's clear from the outset. I think people don't always trust us. Maybe that's another thing that culture has taught us, that organizations are not to be trusted. And so we have to work through those sorts of things. Often we find churches that are divided. We find churches that are confused. We find people that want to know more about the situation than is appropriate, and that we are able to share. Rachel tells a story of one church writing and asking just before a meeting with a minister for 75 copies of the safeguarding report so that they could check that we'd done our job. Well, that was before I arrived, but still, wanting more than is appropriate for them. We find churches that think they ought to fix this themselves and want to try and fix this themselves. And actually, in situations where churches have tried to deal with situations themselves, we normally find more mess than if we'd have been involved at an earlier stage. We're dealing with a situation at the moment where that is definitely the case. And it seems that every other person in the church has an opinion. And now a member of the safeguarding team, they are trying to deal with that and to get to the truth and the reality. So when we engage with churches, from our perspective here, it can be really difficult, and we do try and offer the correct pastoral support. We try and offer support to the victims if they are part of the church. As Rachel has said, if the minister's in the church and not appropriate, we would seek to suspend that minister to offer space and time for our investigations to move forward in ways that are helpful and appropriate. Ultimately, though, we engage with the church and through our process, and take our time to do that well and helpfully. In my role as a regional minister in London, supporting churches post significant ministry issues took a lot of time and a lot of patience. Perhaps more time than you might think. I think back to one particular church situation where it wasn't an investigation situation, but a significant breakdown of relationship, and the minister was asked by the church to leave. And I walked with that church for 2 years. Partway through that, we engaged the services of an interim pastor. But it was 5.5 years until they called their new minister and felt in a place to move forward, perhaps in a way that they might choose to do so. So when we think about churches that have had to deal with and engage with issues around ministry, particularly when we've had significant issues with ministers, we need to think about months, years. We need to think over the long term, over a long period of help and support for those churches. And clearly in our Baptist context, that can sometimes be complicated because we've got the autonomy of the local church. But often it is the only way that we can see a church really being able to move forward well. And that is something that takes a long time. It's not a quick fix, and we recognize that. One of the other issues that churches do have to deal with, I think we've lost the PowerPoints, but that's all good. We might be on the community one now, but that's fine. One of the other issues that churches have to deal with is the impact in the wider community. When a minister does fall, when a minister makes a mistake, particularly if it's a significant one and it's known within the wider community, the impact can be catastrophic. We've already heard about Mike Pilavachi as of an example where, you know, that was all over the national news, wasn't it? And sometimes we deal and have to deal with the media at national level. More often, perhaps we are dealing with the media at a more local level. And certainly from a Baptist Union perspective, we have people that would be able to offer support if a church needs help and support with regard to the news media. Something that is becoming more and more prevalent for us that we are having to deal with is social media and the impact that social media is having perhaps when something goes wrong in a church situation. The fallout that might take place and how that's expressed within the life of social media in the perhaps the local Facebook communities or whatever it might be. And those things are significant and not always easy to deal with. Many of our churches that do have issues find that things like, for instance, the toddler group becomes a toxic place and people actually don't come anymore. Not because the toddler group was toxic, but because it seemed to be that way because of the issues that perhaps have happened in the fallout of abuse. Or you know, we know of an issue where a scout leader, there was an issue there, and that scout group just completely collapsed because of that. And the impact on the community with regard to the church is significant, and the reputational fallout can take a long time to overcome. Trust needs to be restored, and that always takes time. Currently, I'm working with 2 of our regional ministers who are themselves trying to support churches who are struggling with significant issues around community fallout because of the failure of ministers within their churches. This work is difficult. It's unpredictable. One church that we're dealing with at the moment, a few weeks ago, found that all the cars outside the church on Sunday morning had little notes put on the cars, whether they belonged to the church or not, talking about the abuse that had taken place within that church. And whilst that abuse was true, that person, that minister has moved on some time ago, and it was failed to recognize that the current leadership, the current church, is actually trying to move forward in ways that are appropriate. But that fallout continues. We said at the start that the ripples of abuse can be wide and broad, that the impact is significant. It's not just about the minister, it's not only the victim, it's not only the church, it can go into the community and beyond. And I guess as we start to come into land, my thoughts were, well, what do we do about this? Well, I believe that what we should be doing is standing up and speaking out when we see that there are issues. To say it's only Mike or it's only whoever is just not appropriate anymore. And it's time for us, those of us that are in the church, in whatever position we might find ourselves, to say that's not okay. To say that actually there is a better way, and we need to talk into that. Anything else you want to say?
In her first comments, Helen quoted to us the verse from Matthew 18, verse 6, which says, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." Jesus is nothing but direct on many occasions. We use that verse in all of our safeguarding training. We train about 10,000 people a year. And we make sure that all our ministers, leaders, those working with children and adults at risk in our churches attend that training regularly. There is another verse that makes me shiver, and it's Matthew 23, verse 27. And the number of times I think about this verse as I sit in an investigation meeting with my colleagues, it says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." Hidden sin creates devastating harm in our churches and our communities, both in the short and the long term. For Lee and I, as we work directly in these situations with our colleagues, we are so conscious of the need for wisdom and prayer and discernment as we try to unpick events and perspectives, often in situations full of pain and anger from the parties involved. So as we've talked today about our practical approach to this, I just want to say that for us, my team, Lee's team, it is our prayer that Baptist ministers will continue to live up to the high calling placed on their lives and be supported by the rest of us in living lives of integrity and goodness. In the Baptist Union, our safeguarding aim is quite simple. It is excellence in safeguarding. We're not there yet. We've come a long way. And we ask, as we think today particularly about ministerial abuse, that you might regularly be in prayer for your own minister and leaders, that they don't fall, that they don't get to a point where there is no one they can speak to, where they don't get to a situation where they believe that it's okay to use their power and authority and status and influence to do harm to other people. We deal with enough cases to keep our whole team busy all the time, don't we? We're busy all the time. We've normally got at least 3 or 4 ministerial investigations on the go. But compared to the total number of ministers in the Baptist Union of Great Britain, that's a very small number. I'm pleased it's really small. I'm deeply saddened that it's there at all. So can I encourage you, if you are a leader or a minister, to remember that your personal integrity, your goodness, your discipline in following Jesus not only affects your life and your family's life, but has a huge and lasting impact on the others that in your circle, in those that you minister to. And I would encourage you to do it as well as you can, as if doing it for the Lord, as the verse says. Thank you so much for giving us time this afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to come and bring some practical perspective into the conference.